Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Now, some would argue that humans have evolved enough to value reason more than emotions. But this idea doesn't seem to be true when we see the workings of mob mentality, often guided by blind passion or even fear of isolation. People agree to ideas and actions just because that's what the majority says. So why do individuals feel the pressure to conform to majority opinion, even when they know that these opinions might be wrong? And how strong is the social pressure of having to conform? We explore this topic today in more detail on tonight's show. And joining us for this discussion is Professor John Drury, who is a professor of social psychology at Sussex University, joining us from London. We're also joined by Mr. Arturo Gracia, who's a political analyst, joining us from Germany. We're also joined by Dr. Valerio Bruno, who's a political analyst, joining us from Switzerland. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor John Drury, let me begin with you. Tell us, how powerful is mob mentality or group thinking when we talk about the social setup?
Well, first of all, I'd like to challenge the term you're using, mob mentality. It's a way to denigrate crowds. If you look at the history of social change, you find collectives are nearly always involved. And it's those in power who use terms like mob mentality to delegitimize opposition. So you might say, why is it that people are sometimes more extreme in their behavior collectively than they are alone? And the problem is to reduce that to a question of psychology, because there are plenty of ideologies out there, some of which are reactionary, some of which are destructive. And the difference that being in a crowd makes is not that it changes the mentality to be more stupid, but more that it gives people more power to enact their ideology.
Yeah. So, but even in the cases where there is violence being inflicted on minority members, let's say, let's talk about the lynchings that are carried out in India this year under the Modi government, where we saw people going after those who were involved in cow meat eating. In that case, too, would you say that mob mentality isn't a term that should be applied?
Yes, it's an incorrect term. Let me give you an example from the UK. A few years ago, there was a campaign run by a newspaper to publicly reveal the names of people who were convicted paedophiles. Now, when local communities heard about this, they gathered in groups and they picketed outside people's homes and they threatened them and behaved in other threatening and potentially violent ways. And the newspapers then said this was mob mentality. But in fact, what was going on was not that people were unable to process, unable to understand what was happening and behaving in a stupid way. They simply didn't trust the authorities, were taking the law into their own hands and enacting beliefs that they already had about the threat of paedophiles. So the problem wasn't the crowd. The problem was the ideology of punishing people who'd already been to prison for apparently being paedophiles. Yeah.
All right, I take your point there, and let's further elaborate and discuss this idea that you're talking about, which is of a collective action or collective measures taken because your ideology guides you towards that action. Dr. Valerio, when we're talking about this and in the political scenario, we often hear about how hate is on the rise, whether it's from Islamophobic attacks or anti-Semitism. And a lot of this is attributed to the political climate where right-wing politicians use this to fuel their campaigns. But as Professor John Drury was talking about, that these are just ideologies that are emboldened in a way. Do you think that the violence we witness today is in fact just people being emboldened, their inner sentiments just being emboldened?
Well, I agree with the professor. There is for sure a component related to ideology. But today, as regards, I would say especially, let's say, Western countries, there is also very strong component related to frustration, to economic malaise, And populist parties, especially radical right parties, they use it in a sense to polarize politics, especially using, as I said, frustration and fear. It's also striking that if you regard the way populists they address to citizens, they call them the people. They don't call them citizens. And this is very important because in this way they don't differentiate. And politically, it's very relevant today. This problem of using fear and frustration as triggers to mobilize masses and crowds.
Yeah. And Mr. Garcia, please tell us, well, we're talking about how the fear and frustration is capitalized by politicians all over the world. Tell us about certain mediums that make this capitalization more effective. For instance, social media. How is that being used to gather certain sentiments and heighten them?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. And I'm glad that you asked me because my PhD research takes on the subject of controls over the executive that are being enforced without the boundaries of a parliament. So one of those controls are the media, the establishment media, and like you said, the social media nowadays, most recently through internet. But I will have to disagree a little bit with my colleagues in regard of the populist movement. They actually, of course, they use these mobs as a legitimation tool, but also the establishment, the political establishment uses the media and the social media also to impose a certain boundary of political discussion, whereas just within this boundary is an argument accepted or a political opinion accepted. I do agree that a feeling of belonging is just natural and to some degree probably necessary to bound cultural groups or societies together. And certainly nations are built of a great quantity of this collective thinking, of herd instinct maybe. And it's nothing wrong with that, but until it becomes more important, this herd instinct, as to carry on discussions, as to acknowledge knowledge, new knowledge. And this standardization is what the establishment seeks. Very strong in relationship to the media. For example, in Germany, you have two big monopolies of the press media. One is the Bertelsmann Group, and the other is the Axel Springer Group, and they own about, I don't know, maybe 16% alone. The Axel Springer had always almost like 150 newspapers in 30 countries in Europe, and that's a pretty more liberal approach to the discussion. And everything that it's outside this approach is related. It's to be disregarded as a extremist thinking, as a non carrying on to the values of this democratic and liberal society. So I think this herd and instinct and this belonging feeling is also a tool that the establishment recognizes and uses to bound the political discussion. That's certainly what's going on in Germany and probably most of West Europe.
Yeah, and following from that statement that you made here, Professor John Drury, going back to you, this herd instinct that Mr. Garcia was talking about here, why do you think that people feel comfort in agreeing with the majority? What are some of the psychological reasons behind that?
Well, again, the term herd instinct is a kind of throwback to a discredited, antiquated psychology that is no longer used. Linking human psychology with animal psychology is not a useful way of talking. We have identities. We have personal identities. We have social identities. And in certain social contexts, our shared identity with other people becomes more salient to us and is used as a way of judging reality and of judging how to behave. So why do people act as one? Because they define themselves as a group member. Why do people conform? Because other people's conduct is judged in that context as a useful guide to behaviour. There's a kind of underlying implication in your questioning that the crowd is and the collective is more simple, its emotionality is more basic than the individual. And I suppose one of the reasons people often think that, they think of crowds and their emotions, and they say, well, crowds are more emotional than the individual, they seem to be less controlled. Why is it that crowds are more emotional than individuals? Why do we become more exuberant in crowds than we are alone?
All right. So Professor, here I take your point there that you're saying that one shouldn't underestimate the power of how a crowd's emotions are, how complex they are. They're coming from many different facets, many different ideologies are combining for something to result. The reason why that I'm talking about it in this way is that we often hear, in layman's terms, and how people often perceive it to be, that especially when we're talking about violence, that an individual might not have committed such an act, but when being a part of a crowd, they commit a very heinous act that they would have never expected to have. So in that case specifically, how would you shed light on this?
Well, exactly. So, as I was saying at the beginning, the crowd empowers. These people who commit these heinous acts are not people who have changed their ideas, they've changed their power. And going back to the point about emotion, the crowd, if everybody is the same as yourself, right, it validates the emotions, the feelings you already have. It doesn't change us into barbarians. It enables us to enact beliefs that we wouldn't ordinarily have. Like these beliefs around the illegitimacy and the acceptability of committing violence exist in these individuals anyway, and the crowd enables that.
Yeah. And Professor John Drury, I've noted down your point here, and Dr. Bruno, talking about all of this, and you heard the professor talk about how the crowd is in fact just heightening certain emotions that exist already. But what do you see the dangers of that being, especially in the political realm?
Well, for sure, you have on one side, we're talking about masses, about crowds, but you also need the leaders, that they are enabling crowds to mobilize, to being able to channel their frustration, their fear. So this is also important, this component, how masses are able to identify themselves within our leaders. And so these are very important components. Sometimes we tend to believe that the leaders has the same cultural and education of the masses, but in many cases their leaders are quite different from the masses. They just try to be perceived, are very similar to the crowd, but indeed they are not. It's a way to instrumentally use masses being perceived as similar, but indeed it's not like that. Just strategically using them, and this is very important. As I said earlier, as regards populist movements today in countries like Italy or US, for example, when you have leaders like Trump and Salvini, that apparently they can be regarded as quite naive or ignorant, but indeed I think it's not so. It's more artificial stupidity. It's more constructed than natural.
Right.
They're very good at using masses in this regard.
Right. And with that, Mr. Garcia, I'd like your take on this. What do you think are the dangers of collective thinking, especially in the political climate, which kind of banks on people just thinking and following a certain ideology so that it benefits politicians and political leaders?
Yeah, I totally agree with the two commentators, especially with Professor of England, who says that emotions are there, and it's just the crowd that enables these emotions to take form, to take practice on the camp. And it's also very interesting that the relationship between the leader and the crowd, it should be further analysis. This is very little time here to go deep into it. But I would like to just complete the notion of this crowd being a danger in the political spectrum by saying that indeed it becomes a danger because of the big changes, that the revolutions indeed of history, through human history, are not carried just by individuals in form of leaders, but the people that back up these leaders as crowds. And indeed we cannot accept to conceptualize all these social phenomena with natural related concepts like the herd instinct that would be social Darwinism, but indeed the dangers within lay in the form of social change, and I mean dangers for the establishment, for the political establishment, as you said, the politicians. And I think one of those dangers expresses itself. This fear of the political establishment expresses itself very clearly. For example, on the German Constitution, we have this Ewigkeitsklausel, that's something like eternity clausel, and it says in the Article 79 that to change this constitution, this form of republic and welfare state and federal bound is impossible. As to say, it's eternal. This establishment, this thinking, this end of history, as Fukushima said, the end of history. So I think that's more dangerous as a popular leader getting some crown around him, very popular support. I think that the establishment, the uses of the establishment, is more dangerous than any other.
And I take your point there, Garcia, but I want to go back to Professor Drury and talk a little about shared identity. And you talked about individual identity and shared identity. What do you think are some of the changes that in modern society have brought about in the relation between an individual and shared identity? Do you think there are any evident changes?
Well, I suppose in the last 20 years, there's been, at least in the West, there's been a greater individualism. I mean, years ago, there was a collectivism, and class was a stronger identity, and so on. I guess, though, I'd like to, before I say any more about that, I'd like to come back to one of the points made earlier about leadership, because the colleague made a very important point when he said those leaders who try to manipulate crowds, they do so by pretending they're in group. They do so by pretending they have the same shared identity as the rest of the crowd. It makes the point really strongly that, you know, we have this idea that leaders have charisma and they have these personal qualities, and through these personal qualities they can manipulate and shape the crowd to do just anything. But it's not true. They can only influence the crowd to the extent that they can present themselves as having the same identity as the rest of the crowd. And that is why people like Trump and Farage work so hard to present themselves as man of the people. So it just makes a point that identity is the mechanism and the mediator for collective behavior.
So Professor, would you say that relatability is one of the strongest qualities that politicians need in this modern age to be successful and to gather votes and gather support?
Well, I suppose relatability is a kind of everyday way of talking about shared identity. The leader has to present themselves as one of us. Yeah, I mean, if they're too different from the people they're trying to appeal to, then they won't get that appeal.
Yeah, and going back to the question that we were talking about, could you elaborate on that? How do you think individualism has started gaining more power in modern history?
Well, I'd say it's actually political, because in the West, politicians broke up working class communities. All right, so how do we see ourselves as a group in everyday life? We have structures that address us as group members, like trade unions, the way we work, the way we live our lives in the West now is very individualized. And so, in a way, things like, right, and other, group identities are more attractive because they can give us things that we don't have as individuals, like solidarity. It's very isolating and atomizing to be addressed as an individual all the time. Where's the social support? Groups are attractive because they are sources of social support.
Right. And with that, Dr. Bruno, we were talking about shared identity and how a sense of belonging is often needed, and also how political figures can only appeal to the masses when they seem to be a part of that group. How important is shared identity when we talk about nationalism and the broader community of the nation?
Well, for sure, this is very, very important. It's normal that you must be to some kind of identity, either cultural, national, ethnic, and so this is key. And I think there's been an important revolution in the last decades with the use of internet and social media, because in this way it's very, very easy to channel, to appeal to your, let's say, followers on the internet. If we give a look at the use that people like Trump or Salvini or this kind of leaders, they make of internet and social media, they will understand it's very, very important. And also I wanted to say a point. I agree with Professor Drury. And I will also say we have this prejudice that masses and crowds, it's not easy to forecast their behaviors. I will say it's the opposite. It's more complicated to understand the behavior of the human being as an individual than the masses, the crowd. Probably because, when they gather together, also it's easier that they become emotionally or irrational. So I would say they're more easy, understandable.
Doctor, just here, did you say that when they gather together, they become emotionally irrational? Did I hear you correctly on that point?
Yes. I would say.
So wouldn't that?
I don't want to generalize. Yeah,
so
but
wouldn't that cause more unpredictability?
Yeah. For example, I would say if you take the example of the stadium, the football stadium, and you have this crowd and masses mentality, that it's easier to understand. While if you have individuals, they are always more unpredictable. If you have a single person, it's always more unpredictable that when a lot of people, they gather together, which I understand can look like a paradox, but masses, they are more understandable, according to my opinion.
Yeah. And Mr. Garcia, do you also agree with the point that Dr. Bruno was making here, that when masses come together, they become more unpredictable?
Is it surely more difficult to control? Indeed, I mean, the resources that I've put together to keep a crowd or big masses under a certain parameter are to be bigger as to go directly to the individual. And I share the view that the crowds suffer from this prejudice of being catalogated as erratic and emotional. And you can see that clearly on the subject of, for example, direct democracy. It is long argued against direct democracy that the masses, that the mob are ignorant and they won't take the right choices given the chance of. And it related itself of this thinking of the political class as an elite, an enlightened elite that could take better decisions than the mob, a point that I completely disagree, of course, but it certainly lacks a proper argument.
Right. And Professor Drury, just a last argument to you. We were talking about individualism, and we also hear about how identity is becoming more fluid in the modern age. Now, with several aspects competing with one another, people ascribing different parts to their identity, do you think this creates more confusion for the individual person?
No, I think it's a quality of human nature to have multiple identities. And people talk about identity politics these days, but people have always had multiple identities because we have the capacity to think about ourselves in different ways and have different relationships. All these different relationships, different group memberships that we have are all bases for different identities. So it's not a new and confusing thing, because we've always had that capacity to have different identities, to be a father, to be a lecturer, to be a Manchester United supporter in different contexts. Each of those identities having different norms. We had the football example. Well, why is it that some people become more extreme, more aggressive, more emotional at a football game? Well, those are the people that already identify as football supporters, so not anybody will be influenced. And when they are influenced, how do they behave? They behave in line with their group norms, which means rules for conduct. So even the most extreme examples normally have social rules attached to them. And all the crowds in history, you can look at their behaviour and you can find social rules, from the food riots to the French Revolution and so on.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Arturo Gracia, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Valerio Bruno, for joining us. It was lovely talking to you, gentlemen. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Now, for any healthy democracy, it is crucial that the public not only engages with the political economy, but that they actively participate. The most important time for them to do this, of course, is during the election season. On tonight's show, we explore how voter enthusiasm is built before the elections and how the public is engaged with the democratic process throughout. We take a special look at political rallies and what the role political figures and crowd pullers play during these rallies. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Rajiv Desai, who's a political analyst joining us from Delhi. We're also joined by Ms. Sanusha Naidu, who's a political analyst joining us from Cape Town. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Desai, I'd like to begin with you. Now, in India, elections, one of the largest democracy in the world, the largest democracy in the world. Elections have just concluded. Voters have just voted. Tell us, before leading to this process, what was the atmosphere like in terms of rallies and engagement with the public?
Well, usually it's almost like a festival. You know, it's like a celebration, and there's a lot of noise and color and things like that. That got spread out over 1.5 months this time because of the way the vote was scheduled in 7 phases. But usually, yes, it's like a massive celebration. Colors, flags, banners, songs, rallies. All kinds of things, and not just in TV studios, I might add. So it was somewhat less this time because of the division, the many phases in which it was held.
Yeah. And Mr. Desai, let's just elaborate on the importance of these rallies and these celebrations and the public engaging with political leaders in this manner. What do you think, what space and what importance does that have in the political realm?
I think it's a measure of the organizing ability of various political parties, because when you hold a rally, a leader has to come there and crowds have to show up to listen. And therefore, workers on the ground, whether they're activists, members of the political party, local party units, all of them have to come together in a coordinated fashion to host a rally like this. So, yeah, it's a measure of a political party's organizing ability.
Yeah. And what about the mobilization of the masses and the people? Does it create more engagement with the democratic process?
Well, yes, it does. It can go horribly wrong sometimes, you know, because the mobilization sometimes happens on divisive lines, as some of that happened in this election. But by and large, it's always mobilized around a personality rather than issues.
Yeah. And Ms. Naidu, give us a perspective of what was happening in Africa. Do you think also that mobilization was taking place on the basis of political parties and their identity as opposed to the manifesto or the values or objective facts?
Good evening, Michelle, and good evening to the colleague in Delhi. I think that South Africa has a very strong history of mobilization around the political arena, the political dynamics of the country. So if you go back and look at South Africa's apartheid history and the role of protest, protest politics is very much part of the landscape of how people demonstrate their frustration, their dissatisfaction, and of course their marginalization from the political economy of the state. Now, South Africa has a very historic and unique kind of set of dynamics from the historical to the post-apartheid and the current political body of the country. And so protest politics has been very much part of the identity of the landscape in South Africa. So it's not something that just came in after 94. I think we've got to be very careful in understanding the environment and the way in which the environment around challenging what had been a minority government in power, and then how that minority government in power essentially basically used their position in power to defy the rights of the majority. So when you go back and you look at the anti-apartheid struggle, it defines itself along the lines of protest, of politics of protest and marginalization. Now, that is something that continues to spill over into the post-apartheid state, because it's a demonstration of what do people see as their democratic rights, but also what do they see as their rights in terms of democracy. Right. So why did they vote in 94 for democracy?
Right. So, Ms. Naidu, you're talking about here how this sentiment and how this political activism is continuing even post-apartheid. But in the elections in South Africa this time around, it was the lowest turnout ever in its history. What do you think is changing?
Well, the thing about the elections in South Africa is this election, you're quite right, it was the lowest. I think it was even lower than 2014. 2014 touched over 18 million. Now we had 17.6 million people turn out to vote out of 26.7 million people registered. But that doesn't give you a true reflection, because we're working on numbers that essentially have been declining. And those numbers have been declining over a period of time. So be careful in terms of how we look at it. But what's also important is that we can't just attribute one particular issue in terms of whether it was just people coming out or not coming out to vote. Here's the challenge. The challenge is that people were basically could have been using the vote, not coming out to vote, as a basis of protest. What has been very interesting in South Africa is the number of protests that have been recorded in a pre-election year. And it seems to spike, especially in a pre-election year in 2018, 2013, etc., when the election is...
And Ms. Naidu, hold on to that thought while I go to Mr. Desai here. In India, the situation was completely different. It stated that the turnout was a record high. Over here, what do you think the sentiments were? What do you think was charging the people to come out and vote?
We don't know yet, but yes, certainly there was a turnout, a significant increase in turnout. I think it was a highly polarized contest between the ruling party and the various opposition coalitions. The exit polls are showing that the turnout was largely in favor of the ruling party. However, we will know this tomorrow. The opposition maintains that the turnout was because people were upset by the policies of the ruling party. This is the usual thing, but we'll have to wait and see. But yes, indeed, the turnout was extremely high. And just to add to one more thing, what the lady from South Africa was saying, in India, the issue often is about identity as well. So people will vote their caste, people will vote their religion, people will vote their ethnicities, linguistics, etc., etc. So it's all a very jumbled up kind of thing, and somehow there are some issues that get lost in the process. For example, issues of economic growth and development, equity, the equitable distribution of wealth in India. These things then tend to be take a second, they're pushed back, and these kinds of ideology issues. And one of the most alarming things this time was there was a sort of a attempt to inject a sort of a, what shall I say, a nationalist fervor into the
Right.
voting appeals.
Right.
And that was that's bad.
Right. And Mr. Desai, keeping with whatever you've said here, you've stated out the context of what was happening, and you've stated out how identity plays during this process. Keeping that in mind, what space do you think minorities have for political activism, and not just in India, but in this region, South Asia?
Well, South Asia does not, unfortunately, have a bright and glowing record. I'm talking about the whole of South Asia. I guess if anywhere there has been some amount of empowerment and inclusion of minorities, it has been in India. But now, unfortunately, that has come under some sort of a cloud. But I certainly feel that when you say minority in India, the numbers are just mind-boggling. For example, if you were to take just the number of Muslims are considered a minority in India, but there are more Muslims in India than there might be in Pakistan. I'm not sure,
Yeah.
So it's that sort of a thing. It's huge, and I don't think. In fact, some of the warnings that very thoughtful people have issued in this attempt to rile up the religious kind of vote is the issue is really that you cannot disenfranchise a minority that is over 120 million people, and it bodes very badly for it. And basically, it can't happen. So I think in the end, the minorities will remain fairly safe here. There are, unfortunately, skirmishes and killings and stuff that do happen.
And on that point, stay with Dr. Desai. I want to go to Ms. Naidu and talk more about the importance of political activism. Now, South Africa has a very, very rich history of it. But what do you see in the world, in the modern time, the space for it and the need for it?
Yeah, I think, we don't have such a massive population like India. I mean, our population is just under 59 million. So in terms of numbers and people not coming out to vote, it's very dramatic in terms of impact. So when we talk about people not coming out to vote in South Africa, it does affect the political parties. The other thing to just mention very briefly is we do know that there's a level in which we have what we call race census voting. People vote for a political party that they have a historical legacy to. But I think the landscape is changing, and that could also be approximated to the international as well, in terms of we had two very polarizing impacts in this election. One is in terms of the ideological spectrum, we had a far-right party which represents a particular group, a very conservative group of what we call Afrikaners, and the other group being the Economic Freedom Front, which did really well, which came out of the ANC as a renegade youth group that essentially left the ANC, and they did very well in this election. That surprised polling organizations who didn't really anticipate that. So I think what's interesting is the kind of fringe politics that takes place with ideology and how that impacts on people's view. Now, what's interesting, both these political parties, and I'll come to the point of why I'm making this an important a pointer to the question, and that is both these political parties had very polarizing views on the land issue, which is a very emotive question in South Africa, the land redistribution issue in terms of transforming the Land Act of 1913, where people were dispossessed and divested of their land in terms of the Apartheid Act of 1913. So what's interesting here is that two of these parties, one was about retaining the land in terms of the identity this had to the Afrikaner opposing the policy of land expropriation without compensation, whilst the other, which was the EFF, said all land should be state-owned. And this created incredible polarizations in terms of the younger voters who may have went with the Afrikaner Freedom Front, which is on the right of the ideological spectrum, whatever these ideological spectrums mean. But I think it has very interesting dynamics as well in terms of how do we categorize and try to compartmentalize who votes for political parties. And in the context of the broader question of what's happening in the globe, like the EU, for example, going through the parliamentary election and talking about whether right-wing parties are going to become an important actor in the footprint of the EU.
Ms. Naidu, just picking on that point that you made, that polarization is occurring all across the world. Now, when we talk about rallies and political participation of individuals in these rallies, do you think that it's just a reproduction of an echo chamber of sorts, and there are no mingling of ideas? In democracy, you're supposed to have opposing ideas, but people are just increasingly becoming more insulated in their own spheres.
Well, I think you can play on different types of issues. I think if you look at the bigger question for me is not about whether people are not basically looking at ideas. I think they're taking the ideas and they essentially framing it in a manner that talks to people's insecurity. So if you take, for example, the political economy question, and you take the rise of inequality, one of the challenges in South Africa is also the question that is a challenge in the global arena, that is inequality. If people feel that their livelihoods are threatened, if people see, if political parties recklessly use points of migration and immigration as vectors in the way that they present the issues, then you kind of use that in a manner in which you essentially try to create these different dynamics, whether they are very parochial dynamics or whether they are dynamics that you try to advance. And that comes back to the question of how political parties talk to their different constituencies. Now, in Europe or in the US, the question is, people have become single issue based, particularly in the US as well. So if you take one particular issue and you frame it and you construct it in a manner that people feel that's talking to me, I think that's an interesting way in which you can use different ideas and issues to define it. But in South Africa, and I think in other parts of Africa, it's not just a single-based issue anymore. It's about the fact that people have been marginalized because inequality has become an overriding global concern wherever we are in the world.
And Ms. Naidu, hold on to that thought while I bring Mr. Desai back into this conversation. Mr. Desai, when we're talking about democracy and a healthy democracy, how important is for individuals to be exposed to opposing ideas from their own? How important is it for there to be rigorous debate as opposed to there just being areas and realms in which there is a reproduction of the same ideas that a person has already subscribed to?
Oh, I think there's a much more than healthy scrap of political ideas in India. I think the one thing, I mean, so no Indian is really unexposed to other opinions. They are exposed. There's a loud and scrappy media, and people get a chance to talk and hear and stuff like that. But the thing to note that I note with considerable concern is that since 2014, and this is the second election, this election was the most expensive election ever conducted on the face of this planet. The American expenditure on elections pales in comparison to what is spent officially on the records in India, and with a lot of other unofficial kinds of expenditures. So yes, this is also of great concern.
Yeah, and on that point, when you're making that, it was one of the most expensive elections here. You mentioned unofficial expenditures. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a lot of concern about unaccounted funds and pouring in from within the country, outside the country. There's some concern about that. There's no way to really make any sense of it because there's no evidence, there's no numbers, there's nothing. But everybody knows that there's a healthy amount of money circulating at the time. In fact, in some ways, every election is a huge
Unfortunately, Mr. Desai, we're running out of time, but that is a very important point you made there, the unaccounted funds that take place in the election process, in the election expenditure. And that is something that people need to think about and take into account while evaluating the whole entire democratic process. Thank you so much, Mr. Rajiv Desai, for joining us. Thank you, Ms. Sanusha Naidu, for joining us. It was great talking to you both. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.